Welcome to Ask Dr. Change. I'm Dr. Linda Ackerman Anderson. I'm happy to have you join me today to explore how to seriously uplevel your leadership and consulting to transformational changes, all through conscious change leadership. Welcome to the Change Leaders Roadmap Methodology series. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering Phase 1, Prepare to Lead the Change. It's the first of the 9 phases of the Change Leaders Roadmap methodology. This is all about effective launch of your change projects. And so I'm going to be going into some degree of detail. Why such detail? Because all of this reinforces our overarching theme of conscious change leadership. I want you to review this information so that you can become aware of the actual work required for your projects to be successful. And also, with your confidence built, it will allow you to bring your best self. Now, Phase 1 actually is preceded by hearing the wake-up call. You can find out more details about hearing the wake-up call on episode 8 of Ask Dr. Change, which is all about the wake-up call and the importance of understanding what is triggering the change. What information, what indication, what got the leader's attention or the manager's attention that a change was necessary? And what did they do with that information to bring them to the decision point of creating a project, a change initiative to go forward? So hearing the wake-up call is absolutely essential to influence all of your launch. Now, Phase 1 is really essential to launch of your change projects. It brings greater clarity for the leaders. It increases the speed and increases their ability to get off on a sound footing for the project. What happens if you don't do this work? Chaos, confusion, lots of redos, all kinds of things that slow the project down. In fact, it was those dynamics that triggered us into embellishing the work of Phase 1. Now, preparing to lead the change is leaders' work. Consultants can support the leaders, facilitate the leaders to do this work, and we can input some of the actual material or information or decisions for this work, but it really needs to be owned by the leaders of the change project. Really essential here. So with your leaders on board to do this level of work, consider how to go about getting them to actually deliver on these activities. There are 6 activities in Phase 1. I'm going to review all of them and then very briefly mention the tasks that support each of the activities. Just to give you an overview of the activities, start up and staff the change effort. Determine initial desired outcomes and case for change, why you're doing this project. Assess and build the organization's readiness and capacity to take on the project. Build leaders' ability to lead the change so that they're doing what they really need to do for the project to be successful. Clarify the overall change strategy. This is the biggest deliverable of Phase 1, strategically how they're going to lead the change. And lastly, building the infrastructure and conditions to support the project. So it's set up for success and supported by the resources and infrastructures needed for the project to succeed. As I go through each of these activities, I'm going to review the tasks for each one. I'd like you to think about what it would take to get this particular work done with your leaders. What do you have to do as a consultant? What do the leaders have to do individually or collectively? And really important is to get your sponsor on board about the importance of doing this work. I will easily share with you that Phase 1 is typically, it is the largest and most robust activity or phase of the entire Change Leaders Roadmap, and it is most often skipped. Most leaders, most sponsors jump immediately to getting the project team to do scope, schedule, budget. But as you listen to the activities and tasks of Phase 1, Notice how much of this information influences the ability to accurately determine scope, schedule, budget. So we can't start there. Otherwise, there are good guesses. Right now, we're filling in the blanks and providing foundations for a good startup. The other thing I'd like for you to keep in mind, and for those of you that have listened to prior episodes, we take a 4-quadrant approach to everything that we do in leading change projects. 4-quadrant approach means you are consciously attending to not only your own mindset, but the mindset of the leaders and the mindset of the people to be impacted by the project. That's quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, behavior. What do you need the leaders to do? What do you need the stakeholders to do? How are you orienting to what actions actually have to happen? Quadrant 3, the culture. What cultural norms support this work? What cultural norms block this work and need to be addressed in your culture aspect of your strategy, which is a very important part of your change strategy. And the 4th quadrant, we call it systems, but what it means is the content of the project. Like, what's it really about? Structure, strategy, technology, business process, customer orientation, whatever the content, the focus of the project is your systems. So mindset, behavior, culture, and systems, the content of the change. So as I go through everything I'm going to talk about in all of these phases, I'd like for you to consider all 4 quadrants as you proceed. And I'll point out the tasks that are of particular importance to take a 4-quadrant approach. I'd like to begin with, again, phase 1 is prepare to lead the change. And the first activity of the 6 activities of phase 1 is start up and staff the change effort. So this is really, what have we done to date? Where are we now? What's our current reality? And who's going to do this work? That's the essence of startup and staff the change effort. We also want to understand the current reality of the project. So the tasks, I'll mention each one and its deliverable very briefly. The first task, obtain project briefing and diagnose status. Like, where are we today? What's happened? Is it good news, bad news, challenging, positive? So the deliverable is a project briefing clarifying the status of the effort has been obtained, shared, and agreed to by all key leaders. Very often we may do a status report or an assessment of what's happened, but we don't necessarily get the leaders on board. And frequently they have different points of view about current reality. So this very first task is about deciding or determining what has been going on and aligning the leaders to it. The next task is set up the project to successfully use the change leaders roadmap methodology. So often we find 3 or 4 different change models, different approaches, Six Sigma, project management, change management, agile, a variety of approaches to projects. And the change leaders roadmap doesn't necessarily replace all of that, but it embeds all of that in a larger context. It is comprehensive. And so supporting your leaders to truly understand how to tailor and use the change leaders roadmap is a huge accelerator, a huge alignment support for getting the project off on a solid footing. The next task, staff develop and launch change leadership roles. This is all about initial governance for the project. Very frequently, you'll have executives and leaders wearing their operational hat, and you're giving them a change hat. So it's a 2-hat strategy for them. So how do you set up who's going to sponsor, what the change leadership team might be, who's going to consult to it, the initiative leaders, the project teams? All of those roles need to be clarified for the project to be effectively launched. So we initiate change governance here in the first activity. The next task is identify your project community. And that deliverable is the project community of stakeholders and influencers has been identified and mobilized to support the project. So what's really important here is, who are we impacting? Those are the stakeholders, the end users. Who needs to have a voice? So there's a political overlay to your project community. Who do we have to take into account, whose needs we need to take into account as we plan this? Note that the project community in change management is typically done as a stakeholder management map. This is much larger than stakeholder management. This is, how do we take account of all of the people, groups, voices, other projects, other work happening in the organization on a page or a screen that we need to take into account as we plan the process going forward. And we've chosen the language project community because community infers we are all in this together, and we want to align everyone to move in a common direction. The last task of this activity is determine your phase 1 roadmap. So phase 1 is big, it's long, it's 6 activities. I'm about to go into the next one. It's really important to identify what of this work you need to do, what's really critical, what of this work has already been done, what of this work can be skipped because it's absolutely not essential to the magnitude or type of project that we're leading. You'll notice as I go through this that I'm not identifying the activities and the tasks by number and letter. What I am doing is giving you the work required in each one. It is far more important to me that you understand the work required and not worry about feeling like you need to memorize. Is it task 1A2 or 1A3? That's less important to me. What's most important is understanding the nature of the work. So as I proceed, keep that in mind. It's really important to understand the magnitude of the work and how influential it is on your project success. The next activity of phase 1 is determine initial desired outcomes and case for change. So what are we attempting to accomplish here? And why do we need to do this? Really essential so that you can build a compelling story for the organization to understand why this project is happening in the first place. So the first task of this activity is to design the process to determine your desired outcomes, case for change, and scope. How big is this thing? And so we emphasize designing the process because so many dynamics take place in how you execute many of these tasks. So you'll see throughout this, there's a lot of emphasis on design the process consciously. And so who needs to be involved? What are the activities? What sequence? What timing? What impacts on other activities? All of that is conscious process design. So this first task is consciously design the process for determining your desired outcomes and your case for change and scope. So a couple of points on this: the deliverable, the process for creating your initial desired outcomes, case for change, and scope is clear and has been staffed appropriately. So the right people are doing this work, orchestrating the leaders. Remember, this is leadership work to actually do this. Now, desired outcomes could be a high-level vision. It could be goals. It could be metrics. Our emphasis always is what's most compelling. Numbers are not as compelling as the picture of a new reality that will support the organization to move into its future. And so the process to determine the desired outcomes is really important, and really important to get the leaders to align on what they want to generate or create for the future of the organization. Alignment is key here. And then case for change. Why are we doing this? As I'll note later on, case for change is different than your business case. That is the numbers, and that is absolutely essential. But in this context, case for change is what's compelling us. Is it a threat? Is it a possibility? Is it something that is energizing us to create very differently? Why are we doing this? How big is it? And of course, scope identifies how big it is. Now, this is a critical one to keep in mind, the 4-quadrant orientation. In terms of scope, how do we address a required shift in mindset and behavior and culture, as well as the content of the project, the systems quadrant? So we're looking for a really thorough scope. The next task here is determine initial desired outcomes. And so you're actually doing the work that you've identified in the design of your process. So the project's initial desired outcomes and vision are clear and compelling, particularly to your stakeholders. The next task is assess the drivers of change. This is a really important one, and one that I've spent some time on in previous episodes. So what is happening out there in the world, in our marketplace, in our customer base, or internal customers, that is driving us to actually make this change? And this too is a 4-quadrant approach of all of the drivers. The mindset has to shift. We can't do things by pencil and paper anymore. We've got to go technology. We've got to modernize. That's a mindset shift. Certainly impacts behavior and culture. And of course, is a systems change as well. The next task is clarify the type of change. Now, what's really important, the change leader's roadmap is oriented to being designed to fit the type of change. Nearly all of the other change methodologies are generic to all types of change, but our very strong belief is, if you don't know the type of change, how do you design the process to support the particular type of change you have going on? It could be developmental, which is improvement oriented, fairly simple. It could be transitional, which is more complicated, but more controllable, dismantling an old state and putting in place a new state over the course of time. Or it could be transformational, which is highly dynamic and changeable and versatile, and it needs for lots of learning and course correction as we go. Very different strategy for transformational change. If those 3 types are unfamiliar to you, I encourage you to either read or go back and listen to the types of change episodes so you understand and can identify what type of change is your project and how do we design the process to support that type of change. The next task is determine the scope of initiatives. So again, as I mentioned, 4 quadrants. So what do we actually need to have happen here as an overarching effort? And the work streams or sub-projects, how would we identify the actual work, all 4 quadrants, that is required for this effort? Please note, the 3 quadrants of mindset, behavior, and culture are very frequently missed because most project teams are oriented just coming up with the content solution. And so this is a very strong conscious change leadership dynamic that we emphasize you spend special attention on, because the process to deliver a shift of mindset, a shift of behavior, and a shift of culture is not an easy step-by-step process. There's complexity there and absolute requirements for your success. The next task is perform an initial impact analysis. This is really essential to help clarify a full scope. So impact analysis is the difference between old state and new state. There's a phase in the Change Leaders Roadmap that is a very in-depth impact analysis that once we have identified the future state, preferred future state solution you want to implement, you can do a deep dive on impact analysis. This one in phase 1 helps open the leader's eyes to just how big the project is. So again, a 4-quadrant approach. What is the impact on mindset, on behavior, on culture, as well as the content focus of the initiative? And so when we look at the breadth of issues, questions, details that will be impacted by the project, we need to account for all of that as we proceed with planning the plan for the project. The next task is clarify target groups. So the target groups of the project have been identified, including stakeholders and end users. So these are the folks that have to live with the future state, make it work, and develop it and course correct it as you proceed. And so who are your target groups? And how this begins to identify they're part of your project community, but not the only part of your project community. And so it's really important to know who they are and how best to approach them, how best to engage them based upon their needs. The next task here is determine the degree of urgency. This influences your timetable, but is different than timetable. I will tell you when that shows up in change strategy. This is how critical is it that we act fast, that we get things going, that we get alignment early, conditions for success early, so that we can get on with things. So this is a degree of urgency. One of the things I'll mention to you, frequently leaders say, well, it's all urgent. Therefore, none of it is more urgent than anything else. And so urgency really helps you identify the degree of importance of getting things, your ducks lined up, getting things ready to go in preparing to lead the change. The last task of the second activity is compile your desired outcomes in case for change and prepare for communications. What's really important here is that you're getting ready to bring all of this information that is now clear and now aligned to by your leaders out to the organization, in particular, your stakeholders, so they understand what to expect, when things are going to happen, and how the project will potentially impact them. So all of that is activity B, determining initial desired outcomes and case for change. The next activity of phase 1 is assess and build the organization's readiness and capacity. This is a critical one, influencing your leaders and your stakeholders. Readiness is different than capacity. Capacity impacts readiness. So the first task of this is assess readiness and capacity. Readiness is more about the emotional ability, the energy, the incentive, the people's really willingness to take on this project at this time. Capacity is the time they have, the attention space they can give it. We frequently find that capacity is an issue that is under-addressed and is a critical factor in the difficulties or challenges that projects face. So we put conscious attention on assessing readiness and then assessing capacity. And again, they're linked, but they're not the same thing, because then we would have to, in the next task, build readiness and capacity to ensure that we have what's necessary for the project to proceed. This is not something that can be overlooked, because it always has an impact on your ability to function effectively as a project team, as well as the organization maintaining operations at the same time the project is proceeding. So assessing readiness, the emotional quotient, and capacity, the time and attention quotient, and then building those for adequate quantity for the project to proceed. The next activity is build the leader's ability to lead the change. Now, the leaders we're referring to here could be all the leaders of the organization impacted by the project, so they become informed and receptive and understand the implications of the project for their part of the organization. But essentially, it's building the leaders who are leading the project, actually influencing the process design of the project. And so we want to make sure that they are prepared, they understand the CLR, and they're ready to move ahead and understand what their role is. The first task here is develop the project team's change knowledge and skills. So let's start with the project team who's actually going to do the work of the project and then roll it out in the organization. So the deliverable, the project team has been introduced to and supported in mastering the change leader's roadmap and the skills to apply it appropriately to the project. This, again, is an alignment and an acceleration strategy. Let's be clear about the model we're using as our guidance system, our thinking discipline for how to plan this project going forward. Take a breath, pause, learn, assess, discuss, and then decide how we're going to actually lead the project. But developing their skills and ability and understanding is essential to do that effectively. Now, this next one's really critical. The next task is ensure the project leaders model the desired mindset and behavior. And so when you've gone through the drivers of change and scoping, you've begun to identify the ideal mindset and behavior required for the future state for this project to succeed. And what we're after here is the leaders go first. How do we actually ensure the leaders that everyone else is looking up to can model the new mindset, talk from it, have the right language, have the right orientation and attitude, and the right behavior that demonstrates their alignment with and belief in the necessity of the future state. So we actually do interventions here to ensure the leaders are paying attention and knowing it's not just about the stakeholders needing to change, they need to change to become champions of the future state of the project. In the absence of that, the project loses credibility. And so we're really after ensuring the leaders understand what this means to them to be models of the future state. The last task in this activity, build commitment and alignment in the impacted leaders. So often we find the empty head nod. Yes, this is a good idea. Yes, let's go ahead with this project. Without the leaders truly understanding what it means to them, their part of the organization, their team, their leadership style, and the ways in which they're operating. And so building their commitment and alignment is really essential, clarifying what their role is to produce the outcome. That's absolutely essential in building their ability to lead the change effectively. So this whole activity is about supporting the project team and the leaders to be on the right track, doing the right things, saying the right things in an aligned, unified way. The next activity is really critical to produce the overarching deliverable of phase one, and that is clarify overall change strategy. Now, I've talked in prior episodes about change strategy. This is very different than your project plan. Strategy is strategy. It's strategic. It's guidance. The project plan is tactical. Who's going to do what over what period of time? We'll get there. But right now, we want to influence the project team and the project leaders to understand how to strategically set up, support, and deliver a project plan that will actually work. So the first activity here is design the process. As I mentioned earlier, how are you going to do all of this work? And as I go through the tasks of this particular activity, clarify the overall change strategy, consider how you would design the process, who needs to be involved, what information would be involved or required to deliver the deliverables of that particular element of change strategy. There are 12 elements of change strategy, by the way, and so the next several tasks cover each of those elements. So the first is define the values and guiding principles. The deliverable here, the project team has identified the project's and the organization's values that will influence the project's strategy and have clarified the guiding principles they generate for how to lead the effort. So what's important here is that values, which are the basis of culture, and guiding principles, which influence behavior, they are addressed consciously, especially if the project is going to influence mindset, behavior, and culture in order for the new reality to take place. What's also important here is the leaders commit to minimize the negative impact on stakeholders. This is an essential deliverable at this point in shaping the change strategy. How can we deliver on this project in a way that has the least negative impact on our stakeholders if we start from that place, rather than waiting for change management to pick up all the pieces after we've generated a lot of resistance in how we've delivered on things, we can make life so much easier if we're consciously attending to reducing negative impact on stakeholders as we proceed. The next task in clarify the overall change strategy is going back to clarify governance and decision-making. Again, this is in the top 5 issues that we see in major projects, especially transformational ones, but not only transformational ones. Who's going to do what? So we are previously identified change governance roles. By this time in your process, you'll understand, do we have the right people in mind? Do we have the right people in the roles? Do they have the capacity and understanding to fulfill their role? This is your second and most important opportunity to ensure governance. And so governance has 4 critical elements to it: clear roles, how we're going to structure all of the roles and teams so they interact effectively, how they're going to make decisions, and who's got accountability and authority for what, and how they're going to interface with the ongoing operation. That's absolutely critical here. Interface with the ongoing operation. There will be pinch points. So how are we going to manage those pinch points consciously? At this point, we figure that out. And so governance and decision-making are absolutely essential here. In addition, another deliverable is your change leadership team, which is one of the key roles, and the executive team, also a change role, understand how the 2 teams will interface to simultaneously optimize running the business and orchestrating the change. What that infers is setting up what we refer to as a parallel structure, a change structure running in parallel with an operating structure. And how will the 2 interface? Really essential in setting up good governance for the project. And so leaders need to understand they wear 2 hats. When they have their operational hat on, that's the one they're most familiar with. Then we ask them to put on their change hat, and they're looking at how to run the project, lead the project, especially if it's transformational, model the project's needs in mindset and behavior and culture. And so know how to do that distinct from their operating practices. So parallel structure is a really critical piece here. The next task is determine and organize initial sub-projects. So let's say in a major project, you have an overarching way of changing things. So like an umbrella strategy. And within it, you've got many sub-projects. Maybe they get aligned and clustered into work streams, very common. So how do we identify the sub-projects? Remember, we did an initial impact analysis and scope. So we have an idea of the projects and the sub-projects within the umbrella initiative. And then we organize them so that we can get leaders in place and teams in place to orchestrate them. So this work is organizing the initial sub-projects, and if you have them, work streams. The next task is determine fit and organizational priority of the overall project. So this is a key one. So the fit is what else is happening in the organization around this project that is of equal importance, greater importance, or lesser importance. So we know the degree of importance of this change project. Once we identify the fit of what happens above and below and within, then we can determine its level of priority. If everything happening in the organization is number 1 priority, then like urgency, none of it is number 1 priority. So how do we actually determine where this project fits in everything else going on in the organization, and what is its level of priority? Once we understand the true level of priority, then it can be adequately resourced and paced and sequenced to deliver its best outcomes. So this is a really critical one. And this, by the way, could be the initiation of what we call an enterprise change agenda. which is the subject of another episode, but a way of orchestrating all of the change happening in the organization so the leaders have a conscious picture of what is being initiated in the organization and needing their attention. The next task is create multiple project integration strategy. Wherever you have multiple sub-projects, you have an integration strategy. They impact each other, or those that are interdependent impact each other and need to be coordinated. Or you can, it's an acceleration strategy, do work across several sub-projects at the same time to reduce capacity, reduce resource utilization. And so your multiple project integration strategy, it determines how best to orchestrate the complexity of the sub-projects going on. Keep in mind, there also may need to be a separate multiple project integration strategy for this project and other major projects happening outside of it. And so there's an up and across integration strategy, not just a down and in integration strategy. There may be two. And so who's going to orchestrate that is really important. The next task is identify bold actions. This is one that we actually have some fun with, which is all about getting the project's stakeholders' attention that this project is not going away and is really important. Sometimes it's a big announcement, sometimes it's some kind of event, sometimes it's some way of getting stakeholders who may be complacent and accustomed to traditionally how they do things to get their attention to say, you know what, Toto, we are not in Kansas anymore. And so how do we actually get their attention? So some strategy on bold actions may be needed. The next task, clarify your engagement strategy and your engagement process. Now you'll have a more detailed engagement plan, which we'll get to shortly, but this is strategically, who do we need to engage? What's most important to get people, to feel compelled to contribute their best? And what process will we use to determine our engagement strategy? So engagement is far different than just telling people to change. It really is asking them what their best thinking is on a particular task in all of the change leaders roadmap. Engagement doesn't just happen at the beginning. In fact, it does, but it also happens throughout your change project. So strategically, what guidance do you want to give the project team or those identifying your engagement plan to have to engage the right stakeholders at the right time in the right tasks? The next task here is design the overall communication strategy. So similar to engagement, since the two are very closely linked, you will have a communication plan that gets generated in the next phase. At this point, this is strategically, how often do we want to communicate? How do we want to create guidelines or requirements for communication? Who are the critical people who need to be heard in the organization? So we're setting up the leaders and the sponsors to be spokespeople for the project. So this is communication strategy, and we'll get to planning shortly. The next task then is determining change acceleration strategies. Every sponsor wants it to go faster than it is. And so typically the orientation is, what work can we cut out so it goes faster? This orientation in the change leaders roadmap from a conscious standpoint is, how do we set up conditions for success and get this upfront phase one work done so we have clarity, alignment, and a sound footing for launching the change project? And so really essential understanding for acceleration. Not to say, again, you have to do everything that's in this, but to be able to look at the highest leverage tasks that will get you farthest along in your project. The next task is secure commitment for resources. So we say scope, schedule, budget. So this is budget and other kinds of resources that may also be necessary. It's not just about finances. So we begin to have an idea of what's going to be required resource-wise for the project to take place. Again, right now in the process, these are good guesstimates. They aren't necessarily definitive, nor do I want you to get the leaders to lock in on a resource evaluation. What resources do we think we'll need? And then how can we get their commitment to reevaluate resources when we discover we need something else, something in addition or something different? The last task then in clarifying your overall change strategy is identify milestones and timeline, and then compile the change strategy. So milestones are critical events. It's not your tactical plan. It influences your tactical plan. But these are critical blocks of work that need to be done over a period of time. And so this is guidance to communicate to the organization so they have a sense of the action that's going to take place and over what period of time, so they can plan for the impact on them. And then timeline, this too is a guesstimate and not something to get locked into. And so what's really important here is being able to negotiate flexibility in speed and pace. And so we'll get to where we actually get more concrete about timeline. That happens later after we've done much more work and analysis on the project, which we'll get to. So what's important here is that you have a sense of what needs to happen over what period of time, in what way, at a high level, at a strategic way. So this activity, as I said, clarifying your overall change strategy, is the biggest deliverable of phase one. And so when you go back over these tasks to determine its purpose, its value, its importance in executing the project effectively, know that your change strategy then will be given to the project team to help guide and align their work and accelerate their work so they have clarity about how to proceed. Then the last activity of phase one is build the infrastructure and conditions to support the project. The project doesn't run without a solid footing and framework. So this is infrastructure and conditions to ensure it's set up successfully. So the first, and what I consider to be one of the most important tasks here, is create conditions for success. So deliverables, conditions for success have been identified, committed to, and initiated, and the process and roles for monitoring them have been clarified. Now, I've done a whole episode on conditions for success. I encourage you to read that or listen to that. These really are the factors and circumstances that you need to consciously put in place to achieve the outcomes of the project. It could be the obvious ones. It could be resources. It could be time and attention. But there are many that are mindset, behavior, and cultural related as well that ensure the project can proceed. And when the project hits roadblocks, it's important to look at, one, have we set up a condition for success that will influence this roadblock and undo it? Or have we missed a condition for success that's at cause of this roadblock? And so conditions for success, it's a powerful and simple, but really impactful strategy. And so how do we identify and then support conditions for success over time? The next task here in this activity is initiate strategies for supporting people through their emotional reactions and resistance. So change management is very oriented to handling stakeholder resistance. So this is strategically at the very front. How do we set this up, set the project up to have the least impact, negative impact on stakeholders? And how will we support them when resistance does show up, as it will? And so it's getting the leaders to step into the stakeholders' shoes. It's, again, a conscious strategy to be able to look at what is needed from them to meet with, to listen to support, to acknowledge reactions in the organization. It doesn't mean everything's going to be hunky-dory for everybody. There are often negative impacts on people. How can we deal with them in the most effective way that support people to be as constructive as possible in executing the project? The next task is initiate course correction strategy and process. Now, if your project is transformational and you understand what that means, automatically there's active and ongoing course correction needed. So often organizations say, get it right from the beginning out of the gate and don't make any variances to the plan. Well, that's not true of transformational change, really, or transitional change. There are adjustments that we recognize along the way that we need to make. So in this case, it's not just, okay, fine, we'll make adjustments when we need to. What kind of a system and strategy is needed to legitimize surfacing, safely surfacing, and then making critical course corrections? Your change leadership team is typically the ones to make the strategic navigation course corrections. So that's what we need to account for in the design of your course correction system and strategy and process. The next task is design your information management system. Inevitably, with complex change projects, who's going to manage the information that comes out of the project teams or gets delivered out in the organization? And so we really want a conscious approach so things stay organized. So documenting decisions made, the follow-on, the course corrections, how are we going to manage the information? Even setting agendas is a part of information management. How are we going to deal with handling the information that comes up or is needed or shows up over time for the project to be well managed? The next task is initiate temporary support mechanisms. And so the deliverable here, temporary change support structures, systems, policies, roles, and technologies have been designed and initiated. Now, temporary is the critical word here. So often with major changes, let's say you have a major organizational structure change with lots of different people's jobs being affected or vacated, how can you accelerate the job placement process or create policies that allow people to feel confident they'll have a job at the end of the project? So these are temporary things that get set in place. Sometimes we have skunk works or special project teams that handle the critical things necessary that will accelerate, it's an acceleration strategy, accelerate the work of the project and not necessarily carry on into the future unless we deem them really appropriate, which happens sometimes. It's an agile move. How do we create something for the interim to get things to move faster? And then the next task is initiate strategies for dealing with the political dynamic. This is really key. Every major change effort is fraught with politics. And so what we're after here is being conscious of the political dynamics at play. We can't ignore them. We can't deny them. We can't pretend they don't exist. They do. And so how do we work with them constructively to, one, identify them safely, confidentially, and then work to minimize any negative political dynamics or competitions or, ego-driven self-agendas that will impact the project. And so again, taking a conscious approach is dealing overtly with political dynamics in a constructive, positive, face-saving way. The next task is determining the measurements of change. So what metrics are we going to use? What can we identify in terms of speed or resources or work accomplished, goals accomplished? What kind of metrics are we going to use to measure things? And those aren't just around the system solution, but potentially mindset, behavior, and culture as well. So this is a very in-depth conversation about how are we going to address all four quadrants in what we're looking for to see how successful are we along the project. It also supports our ability to course correct as needed. The last task of this activity and of phase 1 is determine your phase 2 through phase 5 roadmap. Where to from here? And so, as in the next episodes, as I go through the work of phases 2, 3, 4, and 5, this is the work that you'll begin to identify how are we going to accomplish that. And that's an important conclusion of phase 1. So we know where to from here. How do we get ourselves from here to implementation? And so there's a lot of work to be done between now and implementation. It's where you will come up with your project plan and timeline, lots of engagement and communications between now and then, which is what I'll get to in phase 2, which is about bringing your project and the clarity you've now developed in phase 1 out to the organization and to your stakeholders. That's coming next in the next episode. So phase 1, prepare to lead the change. Obviously, it's an enormous amount of work. We often say 50 to 60% of the decisions made for your project are made in phase 1. That's why it's so important, this upstream preparation work. And so at this point, do you need to do everything I've identified? Clearly not. But for you to understand enough about the tasks and learn the impact and the purpose and the value of each task to know whether or not you need to include it in this upstream strategic preparation work for your project. So phase 1, prepare to lead the change. Remember, this is leadership work. Us consultants are facilitating leaders and sponsors to do the most important work out of phase 1 to get our projects off to a solid footing. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found some value. Be sure to follow the podcast so that you don't miss any future episodes. One comes out about every 2 weeks. You can watch or listen on all major podcast platforms, or go directly to askdrchange.com. And while there, consider asking me a question I can discuss on a future episode. See you next time. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope you gained some valuable insights for your work. Please send me your questions and challenges by going to askdrchange.com.